maybe for 100,000 subscribers, which is very far away, in like 4 years, for 100,000 subscribers, we could all go to Home Depot and we could build a radio telescope. That would be fun, right? So we did it, folks, and I'm really excited about it. I built a radio telescope. I said I was going to do it, and I did it. So that's this video. But also, like, we have to start at the beginning. We can't just build a telescope and talk about the data in one video. So hopefully I have titled this Part 1, where we will just talk about the telescope. What is this type of telescope? What do we expect to see? And in the next video, in this little series about telescopes, we can look at the data and see what we actually saw. So at the beginning, this is where we are. What is a telescope? So a telescope is a device that observes distant objects by the photons that they emit or reflect or absorb. You could also do that. So in this definition of a telescope, your eyes are telescopes, right? They collect photons and produce an image, right? And the first telescopes that we built as like a device were also a lot like eyes. Refractor telescopes, right here, are very simple devices. It's a tube, a lens, and an eyepiece. And they collect photons and focus those photons into an image. And this image will be magnified, brighter, and clearer than what you would see if you just looked with your naked eye. Of course, you know, as time moves forward, science moves forward, we have developed much fancier, more advanced technologies to observe photons. So we have to come up with a more advanced definition of telescope that applies to all of these devices. Fortunately for us, the advanced definition of telescope that we can use and apply it to all devices that we know as telescopes is much easier to remember. A telescope is a bucket that catches photons. Under this definition, our eyes are, of course, still telescopes. They catch photons. But that also applies to something like this, a space observatory. It's a big bucket that catches photons, okay? But what it doesn't apply to is something like this. So LIGO is an observatory. However, LIGO does not interact with the electromagnetic force. It does not measure photons at all. LIGO measures gravitational waves. So LIGO is an observatory, but it is not a telescope. If we were going to draw a cartoon diagram of a modern telescope, it would look like this. You have a bucket that catches photons. The photons interact with a detector. The detector converts this interaction into an electrical signal, which is sent to a computer. So you could imagine a big telescope like this. That's the bucket, right? The photons go into the bucket and maybe they hit some sort of camera, which would be our detector. And that detector then sends an electrical signal to a computer. And human users can use software on the computer to analyze the data or produce images, right? In the case of your eye being a telescope, the bucket is your eyeball, the detector is your retina, and the computer is your brain. But I'm not like a medical doctor, so the bigger your bucket, the more photons you can receive, the further away you can look. And because photons have this speed limit, they can only travel at a maximum speed of c. When you look farther away, you're also looking at photons that have taken this super long time to get to you, and you're kind of looking back in time. So that's the reason people want to build bigger and better telescopes, to learn about the universe, of course. But you don't have to keep building bigger and bigger telescopes, right? You can simulate a large telescope by building a telescope array. The most famous example is probably the VLA, the Very Large Array in New Mexico. So we know what a telescope is. It's a bucket that catches photons. What is a photon? The first telescopes that were built were all optical telescopes. Telescopes that were built for photons of optical wavelengths, because those were the only types of photons we could observe like with our bodies. So at that time, those were the only photons that we knew existed. And then something amazing happened. I usually say that before I talk about quantum mechanics, but this time I want to talk about Maxwell. So James Clerk Maxwell comes up with this beautiful, wonderful theory, a complete theory of electrodynamics. And inside his theory of electrodynamics, he describes a photon as an electromagnetic wave. This electromagnetic wave is massless. It is chargeless. And this photon interacts with materials via the electromagnetic force. So essential to his understanding of electricity and magnetism, he has a photon, an electromagnetic wave. And of course, we had known about different types of photons. Well, we wouldn't have called it that, but that's fine. That's not what we're doing here. Since Newton, right? Newton is in his basement avoiding the plague and all the ladies, and he's got like light shining through a window and a little prism, and he's like, whoa, wavelengths of light, right? Maxwell takes that idea and he does what all great theorists do, and he makes a prediction. He says, well, we have all these different wavelengths that we can observe. I bet there's a whole spectrum of electromagnetic waves, and our limited ability to see those doesn't mean they don't exist. And I predict, I'm James Clerk Maxwell, I predict that they exist. So Maxwell makes this prediction in 1864, and in 1886, Heinrich Hertz, I almost said Helmholtz. Helmholtz of the Helmholtz coil was the teacher of Heinrich Hertz, of, Hertz. Anyway, in 1886, Hertz validates Maxwell's theory by measuring radio waves for the first time. So, it's just a beautiful little story, right? Theory, prediction, experiment, validation. We love to see it in physics. So to do this, Hertz essentially built a radio transmitter, and he had a receiver a little bit further away and measured the signal. I will put a diagram up and show you what's happening. So he builds a dipole antenna with 2-meter-long wires, and in between those, on the inner ends, there is a spark gap. On the outer ends, he has these big zinc spheres acting as capacitors. Then he puts a voltage over that spark gap, which causes a radio wave with the frequency of 50 megahertz to be emitted. That radio frequency was then observed by a loop antenna not connected to the system. So in order to make the radio waves, he does have to shove this high voltage over it, but he makes the radio wave and it transmits to the antenna a little bit further away. Oh my God, radio waves, the electromagnetic spectrum. We did it. Yay, Heinrich Hertz. And of course, jump to the future, and here we are now, and we have studied this whole electromagnetic spectrum. We have telescopes that work at all these different wavelengths, and we have created devices which will transmit photons at all these different frequencies. It's very well studied. Yay, Maxwell, you did it. I have a poster of it. Can you see the poster? I'm moving. That's why all my stuff is gone. I don't want to talk about it. So far in this video, I think I've been saying photon frequency and photon wavelength interchangeably, and I would now like to explain why you can do that if you want. Go back to the Bohr model. You remember the Bohr model, and there's this picture you have of the Bohr model where you have electron shells, and an electron will jump to a lower energy level and emit a photon. Hopefully there's a cartoon here and I'm not just using my fingers to do that. That would be silly. When you talk about the Bohr model, you also talk about the Planck relation, which tells you how the energy shift in these shells relates to the frequency of the photon that is emitted when that electron jumps down to a lower energy level, right? Energy is equal to Planck's constant h times nu, which is the frequency of that photon. Great. So now let's do some dimensional analysis. So you can convert nu to an angular frequency, and you get that the energy is equal to Planck's constant times omega, which is the angular frequency, divided by 2 pi. And then you can take the angular frequency and go to wavelength, because angular frequency is a time unit, and you can take that to a velocity divided by a length unit. Dimensional analysis, we did it. So you convert that to wavelength, you get E equals h over 2 pi times 2 pi c divided by lambda, where lambda is the wavelength. So we can scratch all this extra business out, and you get that the frequency of your photon is equal to c divided by lambda, the wavelength of your photon. C is constant, right? So you can talk about frequency and wavelength kind of interchangeably. Maybe people would disagree with me. I would say those people were being pedantic, but we will talk about that later. So I chose to talk about how you can relate frequency to wavelength by talking about the Bohr model and the energy of the photon that is emitted from that system. You could also do that same arguments by talking about wave mechanics and drawing a wave and like doing dimensional analysis that way. I just think it's really important to your physics brain to always associate a photon with the thing that emitted that photon. Like, we study photons to learn about objects. The reason we build a telescope to measure radio waves from Jupiter is because Jupiter is doing something interesting and we want to learn about it. And the way we learn about it is by looking at the photons. So when you think of a photon from space coming in at some frequency, what you want to think is physics. Like, what is physically happening where that photon is coming from? Do you know what I mean? Okay. The frequency of photons that telescopes can observe is limited by their hardware. Like, our eyes can only see optical light. So what we will have to do is build an X-ray telescope to observe X-rays and the microwave telescope to observe microwaves. However, objects, the thing we're trying to learn about, the thing we're trying to do the physics to understand, objects often emit a whole spectrum of frequencies. Think of a black body. An object in local thermal equilibrium, you know of it, there's a black body curve. It emits radiation at a whole bunch of different frequencies. And our telescopes are limited by what range of frequencies they can see. So what we do is we make all these different telescopes and we observe objects in multi-wavelengths. The Crab Nebula is the most famous example of this, I think. Ta-da! Look at the Crab Nebula and all these different frequencies. Oh my goodness, so pretty. But I would like to take this moment to remind you that our eyes are telescopes and we can only see optical light. So these other images are measured in wavelengths of light that are outside of that range. So if you got in your little spaceship and you drove, like 6,500 light years to the Crab Nebula, and you went like and wiped the glass and stuck your face to look at the Crab Nebula, it would not look like this. It would not look like this. It would look like this. And honestly, these images are highly edited, so it probably wouldn't look like this either, but it would look something like this. We can see optical light. We can't see anything else. Okay, I think this is really important. We often see images from like X-ray telescopes, but we cannot see X-rays. Like, if you accidentally wandered into an active X-ray laser lab, you would not see the laser that is now penetrating your eyeballs and evaporating all the water, and that would be the first of many things you wouldn't see because you would never see again. However, if you somehow wandered into an active optical laser lab, you would be like, what is that green light? Before you know it evaporated all the water in your eyes and you never saw again. We can only see optical wavelengths. I feel like I've said that way too many times. I'm sorry. It's fine. So, why build a radio telescope? Great question. So, radio telescopes are great because radio waves are low frequency, large wavelength, right? Frequency, large wavelength, right? Radio waves coming from space will go straight through the atmosphere and hit the ground. There are radio waves going through us all the time, you know? And so if you want to observe something from space and you want to like fiscally be able to do that, it just makes sense to build a radio telescope because you can put it on the ground. Something like an X-ray telescope wouldn't make much sense to put on the ground, right? Because X-rays are going to be high frequency, low wavelength. They will come into the atmosphere and get absorbed and then emitted as something else. So if you put your X-ray telescope on the ground, you wouldn't see anything from space. You wouldn't be able to see those super far away objects that you want to when you're doing astronomy, right? X-ray telescopes have to go in space so that all this stuff doesn't get absorbed by the atmosphere. Radio telescopes are great. They can be on the ground. Another great thing about radio telescopes is that, and I cannot say how exciting this is for someone who used to have to go to the observatory at like 2 a.m., radio telescopes can work during the day. Radio telescopes can work when it's cloudy. Because the radio waves just go straight through, and that's just so nice, isn't it? So, I built a radio telescope. Let's just shoot back in time to any footage I recorded of building a telescope.
Sorry, I just wanted to document how insane YouTube is, because I don't use this computer ever. This is a Windows machine that I only use when I need like DAC devices and stuff. Like a lot of science software is written for Windows, and so I just needed one. And I've never logged on to my Google account or anything. So this is not my YouTube. This is just generic YouTube you get if you go to youtube.com. And I specifically searched for a Radio Jove link. And the next ad, another ad, radio telescope, that makes sense. Like crazy, like conspiracy theory YouTube is the only thing that pops up. Like here's radio astronomy, more, right? And then it's like Fox News garbage. I guess CNN News garbage. Like, this is not real. Trump's approval rating's not 63%. Radio astronomy, sure. And then like garbage Fox News stuff. Like this is what the algorithm wants me to see. It wants me to believe conspiracy theories. That's crazy. Anyway, bye.
Listen, I was on vacation, okay? I was having a blast building a telescope, but I was also having some mezcal margaritas, and I also knit a sweater. Do you guys want to... I knit the king salmon sweater. Isn't it so stupid? I love it. Okay. But also, I could not build this myself. I don't know if you can tell, but there are like these 10-foot tall poles, and they have all these guy wires coming down. And so you need at least 2 or 3 people like holding it while you nail stakes down. And the people who helped me build this did not want to be filmed, which I respect. So here's the telescope. I did it. Yay! I'm sorry, I'm not good at vlogging. Hopefully it's fine. Anyway, I built a telescope from a kit from Radio Jove, which is by NASA. So they send you a box with most of the components. And like with a little bit of soldering and some assembly, and then of course assembling the big structure, you've done it. You built a telescope. And this telescope is designed to look at the sun and Jupiter, and if you have really good seeing, maybe the galaxy. And this is a citizen science initiative. So people all over the world do this for their students or just like backyard observers. They take data, they upload it, and it kind of contributes to the data we have of radio emissions from Jupiter or the sun, and it's really nice. I love citizen science projects, and this was a really easy, fun build for a first telescope. So I did it. Well, we did it, but they don't want to appear on camera, so like I get all the credit, I think. I think that's how that works. Built a dual dipole radio antenna to observe Jupiter. This baby, at this moment in this image that you're looking at to the right, left, camera right, is a radio telescope pointed directly at Jupiter. And boy, did I get some data, I think. And I know what you're thinking. You're looking at this and you're saying, I clicked on a video that said building a radio telescope part 1 or something. I don't know the title yet. And you're thinking, but Angela, I was expecting this. Oh, you didn't build a radio telescope, you built an antenna. And you were expecting this and not this. I get that, but this is also an antenna. All radio telescopes are specialized antennas. I will give you a second to go look at the Wikipedia page for radio telescope and read the first sentence. Oh, wait. I don't want to get into antenna theory, but this is an antenna. This is an antenna. These are both radio telescopes. So let's get into antenna theory. A dipole antenna is the simplest type of antenna. That's what Hertz used to he probably didn't create the first radio waves, like man-made, but he detected the first radio waves, man-made. Okay, there is a absolutely wonderful GIF on Wikipedia that explains how these work, so I'm gonna put that over my face and talk about it, but whoever makes these GIFs deserves money because these are fantastic. Okay, so what you see here is a dipole antenna. There are 2 wires, and the length of these wires is going to be set to half a wavelength of the radio wave you want to observe. And that's because if you see the green oscillating electric field that's going through, that is the electric field component of your photon. You want that to go from one side of your wire all the way through the other. And what this electric field will do is excite the electrons inside the wire, which will send a voltage across the wire. So this is how your radio wave goes to electrical signal. That signal is then sent to some sort of receiver, and you get information about the radio wave that went through your antenna. Okay, so that's how radio telescopes work. It's a bucket that catches photons, right? Your radio waves hit your wires, which corresponds to some sort of shift in voltage, which goes to your detector, which then sends that signal to your computer, and you can analyze the data you get. And remember, the reason we're doing this is to study an object. So we receive information about an object from the photons that were emitted at that faraway object. Great. So that's how a dipole antenna works. And so let's look at this picture of the telescope I built again from the Radio Jove kit. So you have an insulator, a wire, another insulator, your second wire, and then a third insulator. The length of the wire, remember, will determine the frequency of photons that you're able to measure. So this is kind of the benefit of buying a kit. The Radio Jove kit sends you something tuned to Jupiter, so you get 7.09 meters of wire. So this allows you to build to their specifications, you know, if you do it right and you don't mess anything up and there's not a lot of like error in the equipment, 20.1 megahertz. You can observe 20.1 megahertz, which is what we expect Jupiter to be active in. That frequency range, kind of. You may notice from the actual picture, I have 4 poles and not 2 poles. That's because the Radio Jove kit gives you an optional dual dipole antenna setup. You connect the 2 and you're able to, like, you know, increase the gain and reduce the noise and get better data of Jupiter. If you wanted just the sun, because the sun is much brighter in a radio, you could just use one of the dipoles. Okay, so let's just briefly talk about experimental physics just for a second. There's a lot that can go wrong when you're looking at this picture. The metal wires, remember, have to be an exact length. So any kind of kinks in that wire are going to change the length of the wire, which will change the frequency that you can observe. And that might also be a problem because you think you're observing a different frequency. The coax cable will have an impedance which can attenuate the signal. Look at this telescope again. It does not have a mount. It does not have a sky guide. You can't drive it to a specific direction, right? You have to build it pointing in the direction that you want, which means that if your object isn't directly overhead, you kind of have to stagger the poles and the pole lengths, and then your signal is going to be out of phase, and you have to very complicated. Like, this is a simple design, but it can get much more complicated. Lucky for us, and I will go into this in the next video, Jupiter in July 2025 just happened to be perfectly exactly overhead, and also brightest during the day when it was right next to the sun. So I was able to just point it directly at the sun, which made it easier. This was definitely on purpose and not just serendipity. I did not have this box just sitting in my office for a full year without building the telescope. It was intentional, on purpose, and I hope we saw Jupiter. I'm pretty sure we did. I got first light. I tested it by unplugging one of the dipoles and seeing if the signal dropped, and then unplugging them both and seeing that I measured 0. I haven't had time to look at the data yet. I'm moving. There's so much. Please be kind. I will do it though. Part 2 of this video, we will look at Jupiter. Okay, before we leave this little section talking about the telescope I built, I do want to tell you what we expect the data to look like, because if someone says, I built a radio telescope to look at Jupiter, you might expect this type of image, like a spatial image of a recognizable Jupiter where like it's just radio emissions, something like this. That is not what this telescope is measuring. There are all different kinds of telescopes. Some measure like position data and then brightness and different wavelengths. Some measure velocity. You know, what we're measuring is a frequency spectrum. So like a power spectrum of a range of frequencies versus time. So the data should not look like this. The data will look something like this, where the color map will denote the power of the different frequencies we're able to measure. So if there was a big event on Jupiter, we would see like a dark red line or something. That is what we will get from the telescope. And I did already run the software and I did get something like this. So it's looking good. Okay, I built a radio telescope. Happy 100,000 subscribers special. We did it. But before we go, I don't want to be a science communicator, but I kind of am. And I have gone on record about pedantry and how I think it's not helpful to criticize the way people are communicating science, as long as the broad ideas are correct. Like, for example, I would say light in place of the word photon every time. And I don't think that's an issue. I think that's fine. I feel like light and photon are the same things, right? You might disagree, and I tried really hard not to do that in this video. However, there is one thing in the radio telescopy community that I think is not pedantry. I think it is an actual error of science communication, and it is bad. And I will talk about it now, and you can let me know in the comments if you agree or if you think I'm being annoying. This is my Neil deGrasse Tyson moment. Thank you. Your ears are not telescopes. You cannot hear radio waves. Radio waves are electromagnetic waves. Our ears hear sound waves. And honestly, thank God we cannot hear radio waves, because can you imagine radio waves everywhere, all the time, going straight through you? They're not blocked by the atmosphere. Can you imagine the deafening sound if we were able to hear radio waves? We would have to build little Faraday cage helmets to save our sanity, okay? Your ears are not telescopes. Your eyes are telescopes. Your eyes collect photons and send that info to your brain, right? Your ears don't do that. But sometimes radio astronomers refer to radio astronomy as listening. For example, on the Radio Jove website, they have little sound files that you can play, and they're like, listen to Jupiter. And then, of course, you have Ellie Arroway from Contact just putting on headphones and listening to the VLA data, and it's just, your ears can't hear radio waves. Your ears hear sound waves, okay? I'm not a medical doctor, but sound waves travel through and disturb the air. That disturbance causes fluid in your ear to move around, which sends an electrical signal to your brain and tells you what that sound is. I could place your ear right next to Hertz's little dipole shooting out at 50 megahertz or whatever it was, and you would not hear anything. I mean, you would hear the loud voltage sound, but you wouldn't hear the radio wave because your ears aren't telescopes. Photons do not affect our eardrums. We cannot hear radio waves. We hear sound waves at a frequency, and there just also happen to be electromagnetic waves that are at that frequency, but we can't hear those. Those are photons. Let's imagine how a car radio works. And to make it very simple, let's imagine like a 1960s car. Okay, it has a big antenna on the back, right? Remember when people would have those antennas that they would like roll down, and if they went through the car wash, it would like rip out of the car? One of those. Anyway, we're getting off topic. Somewhere, someone was at a radio station which had a radio transmitter, and they were sending out photons of radio wavelength with information about the Beatles' Let It Be, okay? And you're driving around in your car, and you have an antenna, and that antenna is a telescope. It receives the radio waves, which makes an electrical signal go down the antenna to your car. Your car has a radio that has hardware with speakers attached. That electrical signal causes that hardware to do a thing that makes sound come out of the speakers, and it sounds like Let It Be from the Beatles. And that sound that's coming from the speakers does stuff to the air, which does stuff to your ears, which goes to your brain, and now you can sing the Beatles. But you don't hear the radio waves, you hear sound waves from the speaker of the radio. And this, I think, is kind of leaning toward like pedantry, but also I think it's important. Saying, let's listen to Jupiter, and then playing this audio file, I think is intentionally misleading. Because if you tell an average person, a normal person who doesn't spend their day thinking about the electromagnetic spectrum, let's listen to Jupiter data, they think you are playing a sound that sounds like what it would sound like on Jupiter. And that is not what you're doing. We'll get into it in the next video, but Jupiter makes a bunch of radio waves. Those radio waves hit a telescope like the one we just built, and those radio waves get turned into an electrical signal, which then some software turns into a digital tone, which plays out of the speakers and makes a sound. That is not what Jupiter sounds like. That is what Jupiter data sounds like. Like, are you listening to Jupiter? No. But are you listening to Jupiter data? Like, fuck, technically. But why would you ever do that? This scene from Contact is just so silly. Why would you ever listen to radio data? It's like, okay, all right, let me try to explain this another way. You know of the movie The Matrix. Imagine you took every single frame of The Matrix and you averaged the color, the wavelength of light, the color of each frame, okay? And you put them all in a row. And then you took that information, that list of numbers, and you put it into a software that shifted those numbers to different frequencies. Because remember, Jupiter is emitting radio waves at 20.1 megahertz. We cannot hear that. We hear 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Our ears can't, even if we could hear electromagnetic waves, we wouldn't be able to hear the frequency. It's fine. So you have your Matrix movie. Every frame is now associated with the color, a wavelength of light. You take all those numbers, you put them in the same software, and you shift them to be a frequency. Okay, a frequency that the human ear can hear. Even though it's still photons, our ears can't hear photons. And then your computer program converts those numbers to a digital tone that sounds like this. If I said, hey, do you want to hear The Matrix, and played this, I mean, it's technically It's technically information from the matrix. It is technically data from the matrix. But is that what you think I'm saying when I say let's listen to the matrix? No.
What you know you can't explain, but you feel it.
This is not what Jupiter sounds like. Because your ears are not telescopes. End of discussion. It's just a weird way to analyze data, and I do think it's intentionally misleading. People will be interested in radio astronomy even if they know you're not actually getting data on what we would actually hear, right? I think that that's true. Anyway, I'm moving and I don't have time to look at the data, and I think I packed up the computer. I had to get a Windows computer to run the software. But in the meantime, I'm going to read Contact. Well, reread Contact. I have read it before. I'm also going to watch the movie. And I didn't know that this was Zemeckis. Robert Zemeckis, like of Back to the Future and stuff. So I might listen to the audio commentary. Maybe I'll watch it twice. I remember liking some of this and not liking the other bits. So we'll see. We can have a little book club. Read the book. We'll read it together. All right. Does anyone want to come to KnitTube? I talk about knitting over on my book channel sometimes, but like, you can tell these are little fish, right? It's so good. It's so stupid. Who would ever make this? Me. Some people don't like it because like the yoke is deep, I guess. But like, you're not wearing this because you want a comfortable, normal sweater. You're wearing this because you want to celebrate salmon, I think. Okay, bye, 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 bye.